everyone. Good afternoon. I think we've still got some people joining us, coming a little, obviously at the end of the day after school, but I think it's a good opportunity to make a start and we can let them join as we go on. So just want to start by saying welcome everyone to our Challenge Partners Sharing Leading Practice webinar. This is the third in our series of autumn term events that look to mobilise best practice and share knowledge across our network, network of excellence, as well as the wider education system, so welcome. And in that vein, it's great to see so many partners and colleagues joining us from around the country to hear from the excellent Shalina Patel, Head of Teaching and Learning and Teacher of History at Claremont High School Academy. Claremont is based in northwest London, and they are the lead school in our Chrysalis hub, again, part of the network of excellence. And it really does give me great pleasure to welcome back Shalina. Shalina conducted a webinar for us back in July, which was very well received and sparked a lot of debate and action across our partner schools. Since then, I know Shalina has been incredibly busy, getting involved in several projects, most recently the Cheltenham Literature Festival, and she's been using her kind of experience and expertise to really ensure that diversity in the curriculum does remain firmly on the agenda and schools and the wider school improvement agenda as well. Shalina has also kindly shared an excellent resource pack, which hopefully you'll have access to. I will be sharing that following this meeting, as well as a copy of the slides, so that you will have access to those if you haven't already received them. And they're really excellent because it gives you, something to a point of reference in order for you and your wider teams to kind of really get started on this journey, to embed diversity in your schools and in her words, start decolonizing your curriculum. Let me just skip through here.
Watched Samuel L. Jackson's...
So just before I do pass over to Shalina, just to go through some house rules, please could I ask, if you haven't muted yourself already, please do mute yourself. You can mute yourself by just hovering on the mute button at the bottom of your screens. You can also do so by just pressing Alt and A, so that will mute yourselves. I can see that people have been typing their names in the chat and just saying a quick greeting, which is fantastic. Please do use the chat section to comment and to add questions as we go. I will be monitoring that chat for any questions, any queries, provocations, and there'll be pauses throughout the presentation where hopefully we'll be able to address those questions and maybe bring you in to speak yourselves if technology and time does allow. But please do feel free to use that chat openly, and I think it's a great way to get that discussion and engagement going as we proceed throughout the presentation. We are also recording this session. That's just for the purpose of hosting it on our website for any partners that weren't able to join us this afternoon. But please don't let that hold you back from, like I said, posting those questions or getting involved at any point. Fantastic. I think that's everything from me. So I will now hopefully pass over to Shalina, who's going to talk a little bit more about embedding diversity in your curriculum. So let me just stop sharing.
Okay, let's hope I can share my screen. And has that worked? Can everyone see my screen?
That's great.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Hi everyone, I am Shalina Patel. I know that you're here to talk about diversity within the curriculum. So before we do anything else, I just obviously wanted to go through, when we're talking about diversity, obviously we're talking about lots and lots of different intersections when we think about society, so race, ethnicity, gender, etc. And so we will be talking a lot about race today, a little bit about gender as well, and sexual orientation actually, but obviously all the things that I'm talking about are applicable to all of these different intersections. So I've got the very awkward second slide here, which my head teacher insists that I keep in here. Okay, so Just a little bit about me. As Aziz said, I work at Claremont High School Academy in Northwest London. I have written a lot about diversity in the curriculum, as well as thinking a lot about gender within the curriculum as well. The articles that I've written are part of the resource pack. I was also on the BBC News earlier this year talking about Black history and the fact that we embed our Black history throughout the student school experience rather than kind of creating a micro history, which is a bolt-on during Black History Month. I will be talking about the History Corridor later on in the presentation. And as Aziz said, I was very lucky to be invited to the Cheltenham Literature Festival last week to talk about a lot of these things, actually. So to talk about diversity in the curriculum, but particularly looking at the empire and how the empire is taught. And I was very lucky to be talking with the founder of the restaurant Dishoom and Kavita Puri, who is a brilliant historian who's written a lot about partition. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm just going to quickly run through what today's session is going to look like. So I've divided it into 3 parts, and then the final part will be some reflections and an opportunity for questions. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about decolonizing the curriculum. What does that mean? What questions should middle leaders be asking themselves, but also what questions should classroom teachers be asking themselves? What questions should you be asking yourself as a head teacher, deputy head teacher, etc.? I will then be talking and showing you some resources that you can use. A lot of the time, that is what people tend to ask me the most, is where do I start? So exactly as Aziz said, I've created a resource pack for you so that you can go away and do lots and lots of reading, hopefully. But I'm going to kind of take you through some of the key resources in the second part. And the third part, there hasn't been a huge amount of research. There is more research coming, but there hasn't been a huge amount. But there have been some key pieces of research that I have used to help me implement change beyond the classroom. So I'll be talking you through some of those as well. I will try to keep to time. I will be checking the time all the time, but there will be a chance in between the sections if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, we'll just move on to the next part. Something that I find really helpful when I attend these kinds of sessions is to kind of make notes through PPF, so past, present and future. So the reason why I suggest this is because it's quite likely that, you know, there will be lots and lots of things that you're already doing when it comes to diversity within the curriculum. And we have, as teachers, we have a tendency, obviously, to always think half class empty. So I find it quite useful to kind of jot down when I'm talking things that you've actually already done that I've been saying. You know, a lot of things I'm saying is not going to be rocket science at all. So things that you have done, also things that you're probably doing now. And I find it quite helpful to then think about what would you like to do in the future? And I quite like the phrase, what about +1? So rather than kind of thinking, we need to do this 10 out of 10 immediately, thinking instead about actually, I'm doing this now, what does +1 look like? I'm doing this 7 out of 10 at the moment, what does 8 out of 10 look like? And thinking those kinds of terms. So maybe that, hopefully that is helpful to some of you. So here are some things that you might hear, hopefully not, but you might hear staff saying when you think about when you start talking about diversity in the curriculum. So the classics, it's really hard to incorporate diversity in maths or in science. I will prove that that is not true. We haven't got time for this. I feel like time is obviously often a response when we're thinking about changing things when it comes to how we do things in school. And so hopefully today I'll be talking you through how actually it can be really empowering for you, for your staff, and obviously more importantly for your students, and hopefully that argument kind of ceases to exist. And it is October, we are in Black History Month at the moment, and so obviously, as I said before, I was filmed with some of my students earlier in the summer talking about the fact that we have embedded Black history throughout our curriculum rather than just talking about Black history in the month of October. I know that this is something that the Black curriculum are advocating for as well. I work quite closely with them, and they are advocating for Black History 365. So this idea that actually Black History Month should almost become redundant in the sense that it will no longer mean that kind of, you know, schools and teachers are using Black History Month as the only time that they talk about Black history, but to have it kind of embedded all the way through. And so Black History Month can be what it is in my school, which is very much a cultural celebration, because the history part of it is already embedded. So the first place we're going to start is by talking about the curriculum. And actually, I would like to start by saying that really interestingly, at the Cheltenham Literature Festival, I talked about decolonizing the curriculum, and then at the lunchtime, I then had some really interesting conversations with nobody that worked in the school. Nobody that I met there worked in the school, but had a lot of conversations with people, writers and journalists and people like that, who were sort of voicing their concerns about actually the terminology decolonizing the curriculum. And I thought that was quite interesting, because I think what that tells me is that decolonizing the curriculum sounds scarier than it is, I think. So that is where I would like to start. So decolonizing the curriculum is not about abolishing the canon at all. It's, for me, decolonizing the curriculum is about reflecting. It's about reflecting on what subject matter is taught in your school and how it's being taught, the lens through which it is being taught. So it's not about, for me anyway, it is not about, you know, deleting every scheme of work that you have, and, you know, and getting rid of all of the lessons that are already there. It's simply about critically looking at those looking at those lessons, looking at those schemes of work from a bird's eye perspective, and reflecting on actually what message is this sending to our students if we are teaching things in this way. So for example, obviously I'm a history teacher, so I will be talking about history, but I will also be talking about lots of other subjects, as well as also the things that I say about history are, I think you can quite easily sort of see how they're applicable to other subjects as well. So for example, when you're reflecting on the British history that's being taught in your school, what perspective is being offered? So are the contributions and achievements of those from the Commonwealth, for example, part of that perspective, or are they hidden?
On 61016, we are sorted. See it, say it, sorted.
Sorry, Shalina. I think your mic's been muted. Could I just ask you to unmute, if that's okay?
Unmute, yeah. Oh, can you hear me now?
That's perfect. Thank you.
That's weird. Okay, I'll carry on. So yes, so as I was saying, I think I saw something actually in the Guardian literally that I posted today, which was five aspects of Black history that should be taught in schools, and one of them was exactly this. One of them was about the achievements of Commonwealth soldiers and the contribution that they have made. Something I'll be talking about later. And as you can see, one of the quotes that the Cheltenham Literature from my talk was, I said, they're not asking you not to talk about Shakespeare, but we are just asking you to include other voices. And for me, that's what this is about. It's about creating space for additional voices rather than deleting voices, if that makes sense. And also, we have to be honest that traditionally, when we're talking about school history, but also when we're talking about lots of other subjects, more often than not, other, you know, non-British, non-white perspectives have often been othered. And so it's thinking about how can we prevent that kind of bolt-on approach, and how can we blend these stories together, because ultimately they are part of our shared history. So something else that I thought was really important to think about as well is the fact that our students that we teach, obviously I'm talking from a secondary perspective, but this is also true of primary students as well, that secondary school students, they are so much more worldly than students that we taught, you know, 8 or 9 years ago. And of course that is because of the internet and the amount of time that they spend on the internet. So you can see some quite scary statistics there that I got from my brother who works in social media, that, you know, the amount of time that Gen Z, as we would call them, that they spend on their devices is absolutely massive. And the reason why this is important when we're thinking about decolonizing the curriculum, I think, is because just as we have our own echo chambers, students have their own echo chamber as well. And they use social media in a way that we have never seen before. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because more often than not, our students will often know about things that are happening relating to race, gender, etc., before these things hit the mainstream news. So that is certainly the case when it comes to the murder of George Floyd, for example, that often students would have found out about that through social media. I certainly knew about it before I saw it on BBC News, etc., through the sort of things that I follow on Instagram and on Twitter. So bearing that in mind, I think it's important, it's more important than ever for us to think about decolonizing the curriculum, because actually our students, they know far more than students that we've had in the past. But also I think it's important to think about, actually, is a lot of the things that we are saying to our students, is it potentially outdated and harmful? And do we need to think about actually the fact that we need to offer different perspectives and offer an inclusivity that our students experience online, but perhaps there's a disconnect between what they're seeing in school and what they're seeing online. So in terms of how this manifests in the classroom, you know, I'm very, very lucky to work at the school that I work, where the students are so on the ball when it comes to issues relating to activism and all kinds of things. And I have the most brilliant conversations with those students. And they will often say to me, if I use certain phrases or words, you know, I remember I can't remember what I was talking about, but I said something about being cisgender. And I remember that the girls looked at me and said, "Miss, I didn't know what you knew what that meant." And I sort of thought, well, obviously I do, girls, but you know, it's the fact that they are sort of, because they have got this, you know, they have got this access to language, to stories, to understanding that I think is unprecedented, actually. So I think that's also why it's important to decolonize the curriculum as well, so that we are ahead of the game when it comes to a lot of these things. So I'm going to go through the journey, I suppose, that my school has taken when it comes to the history curriculum. And I think it's really important to point out from the beginning that there possibly are really obvious missed opportunities within your formal curriculum. And so I'm going to talk about some of those here. Now, obviously, I'm not going to use the Ofsted word very often, but I'm going to use it now, which is, of course, because of the new Ofsted framework, etc. There are, you know, we have all got curriculum audits and maps and rationales and all of those things. And so for me and my department, it was a really useful opportunity for us to reflect on, why do we teach what we teach, actually? And it was this kind of, not realization, but it was a confirmation, I suppose, that we teach what we teach in school because we want to offer our students the most diverse history that we can offer them. And so at Key Stage 4 and 5, we have deliberately picked topics and units that offer different perspectives. Obviously, we are very limited in terms of, you know, we have to choose what, you know, for us it's AQA, we have to choose obviously the options that they have picked from the options that they've got for us. But, you know, we teach the Age of the Crusades, we teach modern Britain, which allows us to talk about lots of different intersections within British society. So that's really, really important. At GCSE, again, we teach the most diverse options that we can, so that across the GCSE, the students have learned a really wide variety of time periods, but also of differing perspectives as well. So we find, for example, that the Power and the People unit, it covers the struggles of women, of working classes, of ethnic minorities until the present day. That unit starts with Magna Carta and it ends with the murder of Stephen Lawrence. So it is the story of this country. And, you know, it offers the students a really broad perspective. The other thing is that within your subject, are there options where is there an opportunity for you to choose a topic? So for example, in our A-level history course, we have the opportunity to, although the coursework is dreaded, but we do have the opportunity to pick our own historical period as long as it covers a 100-year period. So our two topics that we allow the students to write an essay on is either about Indian independence, or it's about British working class reform and the fight for the vote. So again, you can see hopefully that within our Key Stage 4 and 5 curriculum, even though we're limited by the options that AQA provide us, we have deliberately chosen subjects that that we want, that have those diverse voices. And I will say, when we first picked the Crusades, there was very little knowledge that we had in our department about that, but we have read and attended, you know, seminars and groups, etc., so that we can offer our students that diverse perspective. And then at Key Stage 3, we barely use textbooks, and that is because the textbooks are often, even the newest ones are quite problematic, I think, which I will talk about later. So for me, it's a deliberate, we have very, very deliberately framed our Key Stage 3 curriculum so that the shared history of different types of people is embedded and blended throughout our curriculum. And also at the end of every year, and we did this year, even though we didn't finish the year, at the end of every year, we reflect on our Key Stage 3 curriculum and we make changes. So that it's constantly evolving. So some of the highlights that we, for me anyway, in our Key Stage 3 curriculum is that we teach the students about Mughal India, which they love. We teach about African kingdoms before we teach the slave trade, really, really important. We make sure that the story of colonial soldiers is told to our students. We talk about feminism and equality today. We don't just talk about the suffragettes when we talk about women. And also we talk about different types of people who have a place within the story of Britain. So Sophia Dalip Singh as an Indian suffragette, Noor Inayat Khan, who was a Muslim spy. She's actually the first British Muslim war hero who's just got a blue plaque, which is amazing. Alan Turing, of course, as well. So I think what we have done at Key Stage 3 is deliberately made sure that, first of all, that it makes sense as well, that we're not kind of adding on, bolting on stories for the sake of it, that it blends as a chronological story. And the best way that I can sell this to you is the fact that I just accidentally a couple of years ago, for our end of year exam in year 9, I decided to add a question, which is ironic now. I decided to add a question which was based on all of the people that you've learnt about in our in your school history from year 7 to 9, who would you like to see a statue of in Parliament Square? And what really, really, really was amazing was that the people that our students suggested were incredibly diverse. And that to me showcased actually that we're doing the right thing, that they were leaving their school history, whether they were doing it for GCSE or not, they were leaving their school history with an understanding of different types of people. And I actually spoke to a primary school about this recently, and was saying to them that actually they were talking to me about the fact that they are showcasing different role models every kind of week and month and things like that. And I suggested to them that maybe something they should do is actually give the students an opportunity at the end of every half term to talk about who is the most inspirational person that you've learned about this half term, and see whether that attempt to to showcase diversity, whether that is actually trickling through to the students. So I think you can use that year 9 exam question that I've suggested. You could use it in lots of different ways. So I did suggest that to a primary school recently, that they could do that. Obviously, because I'm a history teacher, we do have to talk about the sort of how Black history is framed in textbooks and how we teach it. So in Key Stage 3 textbooks, this is how Black history is framed, frankly. There's usually nothing on African kingdoms, and it will always start with the slave trade, the triangle of trade. It will go to the journey, the Middle Passage. It will then talk about plantation life in America, which confuses the students hugely because they then think it's American rather than British. It will then talk about the British abolition movement, but of course it will emphasize William Wilberforce, because that is how his sons wanted the history to be written. And then it will talk about, then it will skip to the American Civil War and then American civil rights. And of course, there's so much missing from this story, which is not in the textbooks. So for example, Black presence in Britain before the slave trade. There is a huge amount of Black presence in Britain before the slave trade. We could go all the way back to the 4th century and talk about the Ivory Bangor lady. Today, the Black curriculum just posted about one of our favourite characters in history, John Blank, who was a trumpeter for Henry VIII. So he's an example of Black presence in Tudor Britain. There are so many examples that you can share with the students that demonstrate that, that actually we need to stop framing Black history as being only tied to the slave trade. There's so much more of a rich story there. I think it's really important to teach the students about African kingdoms, because otherwise the students just see these people being enslaved from West Africa, and they don't have any understanding of the fact that there were so many. There's such a rich cultural history within African kingdoms, and even if you just tell the student the story of Mansa Musa, who doesn't love hearing about the richest man that ever lived, and the things that they were doing in Timbuktu, like the anesthetic and the mosque that they built, and all these things. There's so many fantastic things to talk to the students about. We also teach the students specifically about plantation life in Jamaica. And the reason why we do that is because we are framing the slave trade within Britain. Rather than confusing the students and talking to them about America, we talk about Jamaica. We emphasize, the fact that there were lots of Scottish plantation owners, for example, in Jamaica, to make sure they don't get confused and leave Key Stage 3 history thinking that the slave trade was an American issue. When of course, after independence, of course, it continues in America. But what we want to emphasize, of course, is Britain's role within this. And the other thing, which I will talk about later, is that there was a British civil rights movement. Think about the Black Panthers, one of my favorite women in history, Olive Morris, the Bristol bus boycott. There are so many things that our students will not necessarily know if you just stick to the textbooks. So I think it's really, really important to think about that. And again, if you're not a history teacher, are there aspects of your subject where the textbooks push a certain narrative, which actually is not necessarily, the true story, as it were? So I'll run through these questions very quickly, but key questions to think about if you're thinking about the history curriculum certainly is where does Black history begin in your school? Is it framed within an American context, and is that then confusing the students? I had a really brilliant conversation with my year 8s 2 days ago about the fact that we will be using the terminology enslaved people rather than talking about slaves, and they had some really fantastic things to say about why using enslaved people is a much better term to use than slaves. So I think also thinking about the language that you're using when you're talking about these things is really important. When it comes to teaching the empire, where does the narrative start? So for example, that is why we teach the students about Mughal India. That's why we teach the students about African kingdoms, because we want them to know about these places before the British got there. I think that's really, really important. I also had a really interesting conversation with my year 8s a couple of weeks ago about this as well. Is the beginning of empire framed as exploring and settling in new countries? Because of course these countries weren't new, they existed. There were plenty of indigenous people living in those countries. So I think that's really, really, really important. This idea of exploration, I think, is a really interesting one. My year 8s decided that they would prefer the term exploiting rather than exploring. I was very impressed that they came up with that. So I think, again, but also, like I said, I have been talking to the students about how I teach it when I'm teaching them, and they love it. They're really, really on board with it, and they kind of like getting an insight into how it happens behind the scenes. So I would encourage you to actually have those conversations with your students as well, because they say some really brilliant things sometimes. Is the violent oppression of indigenous people being acknowledged? If we think about the Mau Mau rebellion, which happened in the lifetime of our students' grandparents, something that I talk about a lot is, this is why I don't like textbooks. Textbooks tend to frame the empire. They'll tell you lots of things about the empire, and then it will have an activity that is, let's talk about the good and the bad. Let's balance out the empire. And so often students will have to, they'll have to create a table, and it will have, railways on one side. Let's not get me started about railways on one side, and then it will have massacres, famines, etc. on the other side. I think we can all agree that those two things do not weigh each other out. There's no balance there. And so, again, thinking about how to frame this when you're talking about the empire. And then I think you probably could guess I was going to say this. We scrutinise pupil work. So why don't we scrutinise the textbooks that are being used, and report them to publishers? I have reported books to publishers, even books that have come out recently, about the way that they frame and word certain things. I think it's really, really important. Don't assume that because it's a new textbook that it's going to be, be framing things in the right way. But also think about other intersections. This is applicable to everything. But for example, where do women feature in your curriculum? The story of women should not just start and end with the suffragettes, for example. So, so like I said, we continue the story of kind of equality all the way up to the present day. We actually frame it around Beyonce's song, who runs the world, and we get the students to think about, the different, especially when we think about different intersections as well, how the plight of women in certain spaces. So as I said before, I guess in a really simple way, many students will leave Key Stage 3 knowing about, of course, the March on Washington in 1963, but why don't they leave knowing about the Bristol bus boycott that happened in the same year? If you don't know about the Bristol bus boycott, please read about it. I think I've got some things to read about it in the resource pack anyway. But there was a bus boycott inspired by Rosa Parks in Bristol. It worked, and it meant that the colour bar was kind of broken, and this man here, Ragbir Singh, then became the first non-white bus driver in Bristol at that particular time. A really, really fantastic story that also shows that a community coming together. The Black, Asian and white community in Bristol came together to fight this colour bar. It's a story that our students should know. So I think that's important to think about as well. And then finally, before the break, which I am running a little over time, I have got some questions that I helped create for the Key over the holiday, and I've got some of the questions here. So this goes back to actually the quote from my Cheltenham talk. So what texts are being used in English? How are marginalised groups presented and by whom? Are creative writing and drama used to explore cultural identity, race and racism? And what names are used as defaults? I had such an interesting conversation with a few English teachers last year about the fact that they worked in a really, really diverse school, and they were saying how confused they were by the fact that all the students pick kind of as a default, sort of what you would assume to be kind of white British names when they're doing creative writing, even though all the students in their particular class are, of different ethnicities and have very different names. So I think it's really interesting to think about, are you also, when you're using examples, what names are you using as the default? Because it does trickle down into the students. It's really interesting. What plays are being studied in drama, for example. So I always shout out our drama department that they have used texts like Queens of Sheba, which we were lucky enough to go and see before lockdown happened. That is, Queens of Sheba is all about misogynoir. So it's about the intersection between being a black woman and the kind of sexism they face, as well as the racism that they face as well. It was so powerful to watch students performing parts of that play. So there's so many great plays out there that are being written by young BAME people. I don't like the term BAME, but I've just said it. So yeah, just use some of those plays to when you're thinking about drama. Music, what music is being applauded, but also linking music and history as well. I always play protest music in my lessons. For example, I was playing Marvin Gaye the other day when I was teaching the students about the Vietnam War, a bit of John Lennon as well. So, think you can use those in music lessons as well. Art lessons, are diverse people being depicted in the art that you study? Are the artistic designs and traditions from other countries being included? Geography, the maps, what maps are you using? Are they actually a reflection of the size and shapes of continents, etc. Thinking about stereotypes as well. I had a lot of interesting conversation with geography teachers about the way that developing countries are framed in textbooks. So thinking about that as well. In terms of maths and science, there's so much you can do about the global origins of maths and science. The patterns and shapes you can use in maths. I thought this was interesting as well. Is science taught in a way that reinforces white savior narrative? So is kind of science, and it's similar to something I'll say next actually, about, is science taught in a way that is perpetuating this idea that we need to solve, that people have kind of solved problems in developing countries, that they have not been able to solve themselves, which I'll talk about with DT in a second. In RE, my favourite one, do resources depict religious figures reflecting their likely ethnicity? Is an interesting one. I know that I think I saw there was a DT teacher here. So are diverse designers represented in DT? Do examples that use reflect a multicultural society? So is the imagined user of a project that you're talking to the students about, are they able-bodied, for example? Is that always the default? Are design briefs being used where students, again, solve a problem in a developing country? That can be refocused really easily so that it's not problematic. Languages, I think this one is so interesting. And this is something that we can all do, irrespective of what you teach. I think it's really interesting. And it reminds me of, I'm not sure if you saw, this was during lockdown. I know that we were overloaded with memes over lockdown, but I think it was a tweet actually that was, there was a headline about Princess Charlotte, about the fact that, isn't it amazing that she's 5 or however old she is, and she speaks 2 languages. And I remember there was this big furore around the fact that I think someone tweeted saying, well, actually, children from migrant families, we've always spoken 2 languages and we're never applauded for that. I think that's really interesting when we think about students who are multilingual or bilingual, is that actually, is this seen as something they should be proud of? And is it celebrated? Because actually, or do we celebrate, for example, more if a student can speak a European language in addition to English, rather than if they can speak Urdu or Arabic or insert other language here? So I think that's a really interesting one to think about, and we can all do more.
Hi, how are you?
Celebrate that. Also in PE, so are most PE sports that you teach, are they North American of European origin? Are lessons adapted to reflect the ethnicity of your students? Do you talk about racism and sexism in sports? Computing, same thing. The last one, really important, I think. Are students being taught to be critical of information online? We have all got to do that. There is so much absolute nonsense on the internet. So are we also teaching our students to be critical about the things that they are reading? And I guess the key thing when we're thinking about all of this is, again, when you're talking to people about decolonizing the curriculum, it's not about abolishing the canon, and please repeat that to them all the time. It's not about abolishing the canon, it's about creating space. And it's about blending these diverse stories within the narrative rather than bolting it on and othering it. And the other thing is, this is not a short-term process. It will take a long time to get there, but it is worth it. And so This is just one final thing about challenging gender in the classroom. This is more helpful, I think, for if you are a newly qualified teacher or if you've got student teachers with you, then you'll get this. I won't go through this slide, but you'll get this slide when Aziz sends it over to you. And I'm just very conscious that we're on to the next section. So Aziz, do I need to pause or should I continue?
Yeah, just to pause there quickly, Shalina, just to say, yeah, amazing. Thank you. So much detail, I think, that you've covered there, and really interesting to hear about the kind of intersections between, I guess, the prescriptive curriculum and then how you can adapt that to make it more diverse. There was just a point from, sorry, their moniker on the chat is L Home 5, but they've raised an interesting point, and I just think I can bring them in to maybe expand on the page. So I don't know if they would like to unmute and expand on that at all.
Sorry, yeah, hi, that was me. My name's Lindsay. I work at Parliament Hill in Camden. There's a TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who wrote Half a Yellow Sun and Americana and Purple Hibiscus, that used to be on the GCSE spec, but was unceremoniously removed by Michael Gove.
Yeah.
And it's a really great TED talk about how she grew up in Nigeria reading, you know, kind of famous 5 type books, and all of her characters drank ginger beer and ate, you know, marmalade sandwiches, even though she'd never had these things, and how it coloured her writing from a young age.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I might have put that link in the resource pack, actually. I'm not sure, but she is absolutely incredible. And you, Liz, you raised a really, really good point that obviously because of the changes that Michael Gove made, unfortunately, obviously, like you've just pointed out, there are limitations in terms of the things that, especially at Key Stage 4 and 5, the kind of the diverse authors and things that we can talk to students about. So I think that's why that kind of time in Key Stage 3 where we do have control over what we can teach the students is really, really important. And like I said, at Key Stage 5, if there are those opportunities where you've got a coursework element or something, I know in A-level, I'm thinking AQA A-level English, there is that opportunity, for example. But yeah, you're right that it's unfortunate that, you know, the government interference in the curriculum has kind of led to us having less opportunities to use diverse voices.
Thanks for coming in there, Lindsay. That was fantastic. And there's no other questions in the chat for the moment. Just to say, I think you sparked my interest in thinking that I should have opened with some Marvin Gaye music while people waiting to join. But I think that's everything for the moment, Shalina. So when you are ready, if you would like to carry on for this section, and like I said, just to say, if anyone does have any queries or questions, please do post them in the chat.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, so the next section is, like I said, people always ask me where do we start when it comes to resources, and I am going to share with you my secrets about this. So my biggest secret, which is not a secret at all of anyone that knows me, is I use Instagram a huge amount to find diverse stories, and in the resource pack I have created a list of resources for every subject. There's way more than that's on this slide here. This is kind of my original slide that's now grown in size, but there's also lots of general resources for every subject. So if there's an @ sign, it means it's an Instagram account. So you can just look at these. If you don't have an Instagram account yourself, you can look, all of these pages that I've posted are public. So you will just be able to actually look in a browser. But otherwise, I would suggest just actually creating an Instagram account is free, and then you can just look through them on your phone. So Instagram for me is a place where I think this kind of, it has given people the opportunity to freely post and share stories about people that I haven't known about, and that I now teach to my students, for example. So there's lots and lots of examples there. There's also, I've got links to some TED Talks, as Lindsay said. So I'll just point out a couple actually that are on the screen now. So if you look at the English one, then there are a few different ones, there, but there are some poets on there that I think our students can often sometimes assume poets are kind of another time, but actually on Instagram we call them Insta poets. There are some amazing, they're all women actually, the ones that I've suggested here. There are some amazing women who are Insta poets who I know my students absolutely love. So Rupi Kaur, I have a picture of her in my classroom, and the students absolutely love her work. She is absolutely incredible. So I think that she's an amazing person to think about. I'm going to talk about DT later actually, but there's loads of stuff online to do with STEM subjects as well. So there's loads of Instagram accounts that celebrate amazing women in science, for example. And then in terms of the everyone section that I've got there are so many great resources there that you can use. You've got working class history, for example. Brown history is great as well. And yeah, there's quite a few different ones there. So what I would suggest, if you are a school leader or somebody that can get involved in that is involved in CPD in your school, this is something that I have done. So something that you could do is send out this, show this on a screen or send it out to your staff, and then I can prove that you can find diverse examples in 5 minutes, 6 minutes. So I call this the kind of the wow / I didn't know that. So if you send this link out to staff, and then your instruction is simply, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to scroll on Instagram or on one of these links that I've sent, not the videos obviously, but because of the time, and simply just say to them, find me something that you could tell your students tomorrow that links with your curriculum area. And I guarantee you that every single person will find an inspirational story. So I really recommend using Instagram, as well as there's lots and lots of other resources in the resource pack. There's so many more. I guess the point I'm trying to make here basically is that you find inspiration in the most unusual of places, but also this is simply something that didn't exist a few years ago. You know, I think Instagram was actually 10 years old this week, but I think certainly in the last 5 or 6 years it's being used more and more to showcase these amazing stories. So I think that is a really useful place to think about when it comes to resources. I'm going to plug something of my own now. I started a history Instagram account during lockdown. That is a lie on there. It says 10.9. I think I now have 13,000 followers, 13,100 followers. It's kind of insane how it's growing so quickly. But I have had the most amazing messages from teachers all across the country saying that they use the posts that I write to include in their curriculum. I was just supposed to put it on the screen actually. I had a message from someone the other day who's made a display in her corridor of the posts that I've made, and it is incredible. So I would really recommend going on the history corridor. I put my heart and soul into writing these posts about different people from throughout, mostly they are people from British history, but I do have people from different parts of history as well. But I've just got a list here of some of my favourite people from history, and also these are people that have been part of British history before Windrush, because again, it seems like textbooks often frame, Black history, non-white presence as being a modern phenomenon, but that is simply not the case. And so there is a list of people that I would suggest talking to the students about, for example. Here's another example, which is, when you start, I know a lot of you have already way far down on this journey, and hopefully you found the same, which is that when you start speaking to staff about diversity in the curriculum, they will run with it. And the best example that I can give you is this one here, where I remember that I spoke to heads of department about diversity in the curriculum and some of the things that I have been doing. And then I remember I was inundated with emails. One email that I remember was from the head of DT, who we just had a heart to heart. He said, look, I'm trying to get girls interested in DT. I want to inspire them. Can you help me find some interesting people? And so these 3 people are 3 women, young women, doing incredibly innovative things when it comes to design. So you've got Good Empire Laser. They, as you can see, they laser on coke. They laser on all kinds of things for amazing companies. Grain and Knot is she's a woodworker. She does incredible things. She's based in East London. Then Anisha Palmer London makes this laser cuts, this incredible jewelry that is also inspired by Indian jewelry and by Indian history, etc. So that's just an example of, this will spark conversations, and it will spark conversation. You know, I never would have thought that I would have a conversation with the head of DT about, you know, inspiring girls to do DT, but we had a great conversation about it. I went away and did some research, and actually now know these 3 people, having talked to them about the fact that they're inspiring young girls. So that is an example. Another example, these ones, which I love, which is, again, you know, talking to staff about diversity, is that they will run with it. Like I said, there's an example here of the German department who started a project about thinking about diverse people in Germany, because they kind of reflected on the fact that the textbooks that they use just feature white German straight people, and so they wanted to make sure that the students understand the fact that Germany is actually a really diverse place to live. The science department did this amazing thing. Again, they had a homework project, and this student wrote about her grandfather, who was a doctor during the Bosnian War. And again, you know, what a great thing for our students to be able to celebrate their own family members as well, which I just think is lovely. Something else that I haven't got on here actually is, again, I had a similar conversation with the English department, and they do a unit on autobiographies, and they spoke to me about actually what kind, you know, have I got any suggestions for people that they can include? So I suggested Cornelia Sorabji, who was the first woman to go to Oxford to study law. It was actually the anniversary yesterday of women being allowed to go to Oxford, and she was of Indian origin, and she has a great story where one of the court cases that she was involved in was she was defending an elephant in a court case involving a Maharaja, and I've just seen actually the students' work about her, and it is incredible to see in their books. So, like I said, this will spark conversations with departments, and they will, like I said, in our schools certainly, they've definitely run with it. There's lots and lots of great research that is happening when it comes to talking about diversity in the curriculum. I just wanted to read you a section from this book, which I've got here. This came out in May 2020, so it's very, very recent. And I will just, I'm not being sponsored by this book at all, but these research ed guides are fantastic. You can see how small it is. They have loads of different ones. This is the curriculum one, but they have loads and loads of different ones under different titles, and they're really, really great. So this is really excellent for CPD and all that kind of thing. I just wanted to read you a section. And it says, she says, further, understanding the methods of exclusion in our systems is important, knowing why it is that some voices are valued or remembered over others. However, almost by definition, to do this, you need to understand the canon too. You need to know what's included in order to know what is left out. That is why I've argued that we have a duty to all our students to offer a curriculum that allows students to access what I have termed the broader picture, learning about the canon, but also how this came to be that way. In order to achieve this, there needs to be a conversation in the curriculum between the traditional canon, what the traditional canon is made of, and what has often been excluded. Considerable thought needs to be given to how this weaves together as a whole narrative, as I believe that it is in this whole that the transformative potential for students and their communities lie. And then she goes on to say, you know, I do not believe it isn't enough for our students to learn about Britain in the Middle Ages. They must also learn about the cultures and empires from Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas, for example. You know, we need to talk to them about the Magna Carta and the President's Revolt, but also, you know, why is it that the Muslim world was so much more developed than Europe in the Middle Ages, etc. And she says this approach is not just relevant for history, but for literature, the arts, and all other subjects as well. And she says, the last thing she says, when considering the English curriculum, we cannot erase writers of colour, nor should we deny the foundational place in the world of Dickens, Hardy, and Bronte. And I think that says it better than anything, actually, which is it's not about erasing the traditional voices, but it's about making space for those voices. So I'd really recommend that this chapter, interestingly, what I just read came from a chapter about cultural capital. So, like, yeah, this is a really, really good, really, really good book, I think, that covers diversity in the curriculum. I'm going to talk more about research shortly, but I wanted to put this one here. If you are a primary school teacher, then I think this is relevant to you anyway, even though it's called Race and Racism in English Secondary Schools. If you haven't read it, I'd really recommend you reading it. It's not very long at all, but I found this report really, really useful. The Runnymede Trust do incredible things anyway. But what I wanted to kind of showcase from, there's lots of great things in there, but the thing that I really wanted to showcase with you today was what they say about racial literacy. And they say in the report, which I totally agree with, racial literacy, therefore, needs to be placed at the centre of teachers' roles and teacher training. It is important that all teachers take responsibility for teaching in ways that promote anti-racism. And it says that, you know, school curricula often fails to reflect, well, obviously we've talked about the school curriculum already, but I think what they say about racial literacy, I think, is really, really, really important. So when it comes to racial literacy, I mean, what I've put in your resource pack, I've put lots of links to glossaries, where there are some great glossaries that have got some really excellent definitions about different things. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this is actually because, for a few reasons, but because actually if you go onto Newsround, big fan of Newsround, even though my form are now in year 13 and no longer want to watch it, so I can't make them, but Newsround have got lots of videos that have come out in the last year, actually, not even just in the last few months, but over the course of the last year, that cover terminology like white privilege, colorism, tokenism, and I think the reason why I bring that up is because if Newsround are making videos about this kind of terminology for our students to understand, then it is very, very important that staff in schools have a correct grasp of this language. I think it's really, really, really important. So I have just suggested a few words there. There are lots and lots of different ones, which I will come on to, where I think that you should, where suggested reading that you could have. But so I'm going to go through a few of these ones. So one that I get a lot of questions about, so I'll talk about this one, is model minority. So model minority is the model minority myth, or whatever, is really important to schools, actually, because the model minority myth is about this idea that there are that students from certain backgrounds will be deemed to be model minorities. So I'll give you an example, which could be that, for example, I'm a Patel, as you know. Gujarati students are one of the highest achieving ethnic minorities statistically. So as a student who is a Gujarati student, for example, they benefit from the model minority myth because, as they are Gujarati students, they are most of the time, a lot of the time, sometimes assumed to be incredibly intelligent, hardworking, driven, etc. And the way that can play out in schools is actually that, do those students get away with certain things when it comes to behaviour, for example, because they're from a model minority, and it is assumed that they would not have been part of X, Y, and Z bad behaviour, for example? Or does it play out, which I've spoken to a lot of schools about, which is sometimes uncomfortable but true, that, for example, students of model minorities, are they sometimes placed in seating plans next to students who teachers deem to be difficult students, or students that have got behavioural issues or whatever, because they know that those students are not going to cause a fuss or speak out against it? Interesting to reflect on. Colorism, I think, is so important, especially when it comes to thinking about girls. So colorism, is the idea that in lots of different cultures, dark skin is not seen as to be as beautiful or whatever as light skin, and so it can go from students referring to students who are mixed race as being as lighties, for example, which has happened, which I have called out before in my own form, actually. So it can go from kind of that kind of quote unquote banter, which in my case, in my opinion, is not banter anyway, to actually the idea that students being comments being made about students who are dark skinned, etc. Intersectionality, of course, we're talking about the intersection between race, sexuality, class, etc., gender. Tokenism, the idea that has somebody been given a particular role or a particular whatever because they are seen to be the token woman or the token person of color or whatever. So there's lots and lots and lots of words that I think that we have a responsibility to understand, because our students have an understanding of these things. For example, things like colorism. It's interesting because the Newsround video, which I think is linked in the resource pack, the colorism video talks about the fact that, talks to the young children about the fact that what colorism is, but you just don't know it's colorism. And I think that, and I've had conversations with students about this, and they know what it is, but they just don't know the word for it. So it's really important that we have a grasp as teachers of different types of students, that we have a grasp of this. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. I won't talk about this for a huge amount of time, but a really, really useful tool for if you are talking about being an anti-racist school or talking about diversity in the curriculum, etc., is to have those uncomfortable conversations. Obviously, Lindsay, you mentioned this brilliant author already, who was part of writing this test. But this is really, the white privilege test, I think, is really useful. We've done it in our school, for example. It sparks really interesting conversations. So I think it's really, really important. there's lots of great stuff out there. So something else that I think is really important is that there's no easy way, or there's no shortcut to becoming racially literate. You can obviously look at the glossary and know what the definitions are, but it's very different knowing what the definitions are to actually understanding how that terminology resonates and lives within people. So I always try to pick authors that are British, because I think that there are some great books written by Americans, don't get me wrong, but I love the fact that you've got all of these British writers who are talking from a perspective of living in Britain, but also talk about their school experience as well, but I think is really, really helpful. So here are 5 books that I would really, really recommend. I've read all of them. They are all brilliant. I actually have all of them in my classroom as well, for the older students to borrow, for my sixth form to borrow. So something that I would suggest is, could you start a book club possibly in school? What I've done previously is I've actually photocopied sections of some of these books, just to start conversations in school. Put a section in people's pigeonhole, have a conversation about it. Something that I find really useful and actually makes things less intimidating is if you do give a section. So, for example, The Good Immigrant, that is a collection of essays by authors of colour who are based in Britain. So, for example, you could give them a chapter from one of those books and just ask them to PMI, so ask them to think about what the pluses, the minuses, and what they found interesting. And that's kind of taking away, it makes it sort of less scary, I think. But it's also really useful to ask staff to read sections of these books and then think about what implications does this reading have for your school in terms of the staff, the students, and the wider community. I think, again, that makes it less scary potentially. But I would really, really recommend these books. I know that some people get very offended by why I'm no longer talking to white people about race. I think those are exactly the people that need to read this book. So I think, and it is, people don't like talking about race. I enjoy talking about it, but a lot of people don't like talking about it. But the problem is that if you're not willing to read and educate yourself about this, then I think that's where the problem lies. And also the other thing that it mentions in the Runnymede report is, do not assume that because somebody is an ethnic minority that they will be, that they will know all of these things, and that they will, and that they will have the tools and the language, etc., to be able to talk about these issues, because that is not necessarily the case at all. So yeah, these are some books to get you started, and I've just added these ones as well. So Dr. Pragya Agrawal, there's a picture of her there. She's written a brilliant book called Sway, which is really fantastic about unraveling unconscious bias. And she has just written, and it's going to be released later this month, she's just written this book called Wish We Knew What to Say, which is for parents, but I think it's also for teachers, because I've spoken to her about this actually, and she did say she would love for schools to read this book as well. So it's going to be out later in the month. Wish We Knew What to Say. It's about how to talk to children about race. She is fantastic. I would recommend, if you can, she did, sadly not the same day as me, but she was at the Cheltenham Literature Festival talking about unraveling unconscious bias, and you can watch it on their website, on the Cheltenham Literature website. I'd really recommend watching it because she has a really interesting conversation, which, and I think a lot of the things that she talks about in her books and in that talk are really, really relevant to schools. So if you have not read any of her work, I'd really recommend it. She's a great person to follow on Twitter because she's always posting interesting things as well. And she has children who are in primary school, I think. So she's really useful, kind of, when you think about the fact that she's also a parent of a student in our school system. It makes it even more interesting, I think, the things that she says. So that's just a plug for Dr. Pragya Agrawal. I think she's absolutely brilliant. I won't go through these in a huge amount of detail, but here are some examples. So as I said before, some people get very edgy about why I'm no longer talking to white people about race as a title alone, which is very bizarre because it is absolutely fantastic. I know that my head teacher has read it. I have lent it to so many people in school. This was before lockdown, before we weren't allowed to share things. And I've just got a few extracts here, which are extracts that I have shared with staff in my school. And the reason why I shared these is because of, I wanted to cover something to do with white privilege. So there's a section here about white privilege. What I also think is really, really important is to have conversations about colour blindness and the fact that, it's what she says here, white children are taught not to see race. It's the same thing with White children, she says, white children are not taught to see race, whereas children of colour are taught often with no explanation that we must work twice as hard as our white counterparts if we wish to succeed. That should say there is disparity here. Colour blindness does not get to the root of racism. And so I think it's really, really important that we have conversations with staff about the fact that saying that, oh, I'm colourblind, I don't see race, is actually really reductive and not helpful. And I think Reni Eddo-Lodge in her book breaks it down really, really well. And she says it here again. I won't read this out, but she says at the end, seeing race is essential to changing the system. And I think that's really, really important, is that if we just allow people to move blindly through the world, if they are school staff especially, and they are dealing with young people day to day, if they've still got that mentality of, I don't see colour, actually that is a problem. And so it is about unpicking that. And I think Reni Eddo-Lodge's book is a really, really good place to start when it comes to unpicking. And also, let me just say also that, of course, people were brought up to not see colour, and that was fine. But I think we have moved on from that now, and I think it's quite dangerous to still live within that mentality, I think. I'll pause there. Aziz, should I continue, or are there any questions?
Thanks, Shalina. Yeah, just to bring in, sorry, let me just open my chat again. Yeah, Jennifer made an interesting point. She was saying that her English department have been using diverse shorts to give pupils an opportunity to kind of discuss race. And I just wondered if Jennifer would like to come in and maybe talk a little bit more
about
that experience and how that kind of went for her.
Hi there.
Hello, Jennifer.
Hello. So currently we've got extra English lessons. So what we've decided to do is use the ASDAN project and look at diverse shorts and how we can kind of have open discussions within the classroom, just not about race, but also about gender as well. And I think it's been really beneficial for the pupils to have that sort of open discussion and see the pupils' different mindsets as well.
Yeah, brilliant. I think it's one of those things, isn't it, where you sort of think they will say things in those conversations that just blow you away. Yeah. And giving them that space, I think using short stories is a really great way to kind of demonstrate that there are other voices within within literature, etc. So yeah, that's a really, really great idea.
Yeah, I recommend having a look, or to the people on the chat to have a look at that and see if maybe you can incorporate that into your curriculum. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And yeah, Will Harvey's posted a really interesting link to a resource called Our Migration Story.
Yes. Oh my God. Our Migration Story is the best thing ever. It's in the resource pack as well. It's the Runnymede Trust this was a few years ago actually, when the GCSE changed, and they've created a whole website which goes through British history chronologically, and it tells the story it tells so many fascinating stories. So Our Migration Story, I guarantee you that even if you are the most well-read person in the world, there will be stories in there that you don't know. So Will is absolutely right. Our Migration Story is a brilliant resource, and it's definitely in the resource pack.
Great, yeah, thank you. And Sarah had an interesting question just around, do you use student voice in the planning of your curriculum?
Yes, we do. So that is actually what we do when I was saying that at the end of every kind of year, we'll reflect on our Key Stage 3 curriculum, because obviously we've got the free choice to kind of teach what we want, to a large extent. Yeah, we do. We talk to the students about what they enjoy, about what they've enjoyed, learning about, if they wanted to learn about anything in more detail, for example. So I'll give you an example. That's something that we kind of started to include, is we started to include more about youth movements, actually British youth movements. So when we teach the students about kind of modern protests, etc., we talk about things like the fight for equal pay, for example, and the women in the Ford factory in Dagenham, for example, and Jaya Ben Desai, who led the Grunwick strike in Willesden, which is our local history. But something we hadn't necessarily talked to the students about is the youth movement, especially the young kind of Asian youth movements from the 80s, who were fighting for various things. And so we've actually incorporated young people's sort of protest. So we talked to them about the school children's protests as well in the 80s as well. So yeah, we do talk to the students about it, and we do use what they say. And the other thing that we do as well is that we've included a key stage 3 homework every half term, where we get the students for homework to teach their parent or someone at home. So they have to be, the 2 rules are they have to be older and they have to be human, because otherwise the students will teach their fishes or whatever. So we get the students to teach someone at home about what they've learned that half term in history. And what we have found is that parents will contact us about the fact that they love that, the fact that their student, and that we get the parents to sign it as well and to write a comment. And what we find really helpful is actually parents are often commenting, saying how much they have enjoyed the fact that their students are telling them what they're learning about. And we have had a few parents sort of wanting to know more about what we've been teaching the students as well. So we've got that dialogue with parents in a really informal but a really useful way, actually. And yeah, we use student voice and parent voice, if that makes sense, when we're planning our curriculum.
Excellent, thanks Shalina. And Lindsay's just mentioned about Florence Given's book, just saying that it's got a whole set of privilege tests about, for example, straight privilege and things.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And there's a load of them. I think I've linked them there. I think it's Harvard University. I think there's loads. Obviously they're American. The questions are obviously kind of American centric, but they've got loads of useful online sort of bias tests and stuff that you can do that are really helpful, or that you can adapt for your staff as well.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Shall I continue on the last section?
Please do, yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'll try and be quick on this one. So I'm going to go through some of the research and also how things that you can do to implement change beyond the curriculum, beyond the classroom. So this is some research from 2018, and it was the key drivers of the disadvantage gap. I've linked it in the resource pack. I found it really interesting because one of the things I picked out from it is it talks about the importance of role model visibility. And obviously this is talking specifically about disadvantaged students and role model visibility and I think this is very, very relevant for disadvantaged students if we're thinking about class, let's say, but I think it's useful when you're thinking about all those intersections. So whether we're talking about class, race, gender, etc. So I guess a key question to think about and reflect on is how can you up the role model visibility in your classroom, in your department area, in your school, on your website, all, the possibilities are endless. So thinking about role model visibility, and that I think is really interesting. It's this idea of a sense of belonging. And actually the link that a sense of belonging has with whether someone is going to continue or abandon something. So that's how powerful this research has found, that sense of belonging is so important to whether students will continue to do something. So I think that's really interesting to think about role model visibility. I will talk about that shortly. This piece of research from Lambeth I think is really interesting and useful as well. It's about the achievement of Black Caribbean pupils. And the 2 things I picked out from it, a celebration of cultural diversity, and also celebration of diversities in terms of assemblies and in terms of having an inclusive curriculum. So my question to you would be, to what extent is diversity celebrated in a dynamic way in your classroom or department area? So is it a tired old display or is there something more exciting and innovative going on, which I will talk about later? Oh, in fact, I'll talk about it now. So here are some examples from when I snapped some pictures around my school. As you can see there, the German icons of diversity, breaking the stereotype that all German people look the same. We've got some examples there from the German department. Use your door as well. I think your door is a great space to be able to use. I love that Arnie's on there. But you've got a whole range of different types of people on display. These are pictures from my classroom and outside my classroom. So I've got an African Kingdoms display, for example. We've used students' homework, this brilliant student who's created this amazing poster about civil rights. I've got a display about gender inequality outside my door, which I often see students reading and asking questions about. And one of the things that I always write about is the fact that I have a gallery wall above my classroom. So there are 2 very important rules here, which is that the only thing I put is a picture and the name. And second of all, it's not laminated because this gallery wall is intended to be temporary. So mine is about inspirational women. I've got lots of people who have inspired me that are either still alive today or have been important throughout history. And how this is now developed is that actually there's two things. So first of all, if the students say to me, oh, miss, who is Tarana Burke, for example, I'll say, Google Tarana Burke, find out who she is, and you can tell the class next lesson. So if you don't know, Tarana Burke is often known as the founder of the Me Too movement. Something that I will also get students to do, which students do now. So for example, who was it? Rupi Kaur is on there at the end, because this one of my students lobbied me to put her picture up on the gallery wall. So that's also a really useful thing to do as well, is actually to tell the students, if you think we should replace somebody on the wall with somebody else, you need to lobby me like an MP would, like people lobby an MP. And what I get them to do is I get them to write down and explain why they think that person should be on the wall. And of course I will usually let it happen, as long as they are an appropriate person. So the students quite like having that influence over my space, I suppose, when it comes to my classroom. So having a gallery wall is a really useful way to actually get conversation sparks with students. Another thing that I think is really, really important now, of course, we certainly are not having real life school assemblies. We're having online assembly, but they're still happening every week. I am at the moment planning my remembrance assembly for this year. A few years ago, this is the photo that I used to start my remembrance assembly. I call this interrupting the psyche. It's this idea that actually you are, students are expecting to see an image of a certain type of soldier when they think about World War I. But actually, why can't we show them these Muslim soldiers who are praying, on the battlefield? So I would say encourage your teams to shake up school assembly time. I think it is a time when actually, think about the fact that when you're doing assembly, you've got so many more ears than just the 30 pairs that are in with you, with you in a lesson. So think about school assembly time. How can you use, the remembrance assembly is coming up. I'm writing mine at the moment. I'm writing mine talking about the different types of people who were not on the front line, but who were who were working in ambulances, for example, in India, or who were volunteers from the Caribbean working as nurses and things like that. So I'm talking to the students about all these different types of people. And here's another example from my assembly that I did on VE Day. As you can see, I spoke to the students about the fact that, what I said to them in the assembly, which was online, was, that when we're thinking about the people that contributed to Britain winning, to getting to VE Day and Britain winning the war, the students looked like the people that contributed looked like the students in our school. We've got people from the Caribbean, we've got people from Poland, we've got people from India, you've got men and women, and I think it's really, really important to use assembly time as a way to showcase this. And I've written this in one of my articles where I said, please put away the PowerPoint of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks and Gandhi. They are not the only people of colour to have ever achieved anything. And I'm fed up of it. So think about the assemblies that are happening in your school, and actually, can you utilize assemblies in a much more dynamic, exciting way to inspire the students? This is the other thing. Diverse things that we should be celebrating are happening every single day. And it's our job to talk about this with our students. So I do this with my form in year 13, but I did this with them every year, even when they were in year 7. So I will often, whenever I see a story or something that I think is interesting, I'll always save it on my phone, or I'll take a picture of it, and then I'll put it on a PowerPoint and I'll talk to the students about it. So here are 5 examples of things that I've talked to my form about in the last month, I would say. I wanted to share them with you in case you haven't talked to your students about them. So for example, Selena Gomez, she released a makeup line called Rare Beauty. And she actually created this makeup line so that it was easier for customers that can't open things because they've got arthritis, for example, to open this makeup more easily. So that's a great example relating to DT, about this. A makeup line has been created with people who are not able-bodied in mind, for example. Great example, another example is Jaspreet Kaur, who's a great poet and Insta poet, and she's also actually a former history teacher. She was part of the BBC's opening of the T20, women's T20, with a great poem called Our Game 2, which was fantastic. I showed it to my form and they loved it. March Muses, they have just brought out, re-released their Christmas decorations of colour, which are fantastic. That sparked a really great conversation with my form, because I have one. So I showed it to them and I got them to talk about how amazing it was. Of course, I'm sure you all know about the furore over The diversity dance group, again, showed it to the students, had a really interesting conversation with them about it. And my students loved this one, the last one. 18-year-old Canadian actor Iman Vellani is going to be the first Muslim superhero, Ms. Marvel, which is amazing. So all of these things are things we should be talking to the students about, because they're such great examples. And there are things, honestly, that happen every single day. So just save them, make a note of them, talk to the students about them, send them out to staff. That's what I do as well. Send them out to staff, say, look, here are some things I'm talking to my form about. Feel free to use it as well. And, you know, it just starts a really interesting conversation in school, which I think is really important. Trips, we can't go on trips anytime soon, but when we do go on trips, for example, we go on the classic battlefields trip to Belgium and France. But something that we do, which is so important, is that we go and visit a cemetery where there are Indian soldiers buried. We get the students to write a little card as well. So there's an example of one from 2019. So again, you know, obviously school trips are something that we can't really be talking about at the moment. But when you do go on school trips, can you think of ways that you can demonstrate? You know, I think it's not very usual that schools will go to visit a cemetery where they're Indian soldiers, but we do it, and it is so moving and just incredible to see that, to show the students this. So I think that's really, really important. There are so many resources out there that are just brilliant. Here are some examples. I've got all of these in my classroom. I lend them to the students. They're fantastic. They're really, really helpful just to get some inspiration for primary and secondary. And they're just really useful as well, even just to talk for form tutors, to talk about in tutorial time and things like that. Here are some examples that are about the LGBTQ community. I've got all of these as well. Celebrating Difference, the one by Sean Dellanty, is fantastic. If you are a school leader or you know, someone who has got an influence over CPD, PHSE, etc., I'd really recommend reading this book. It's been published by Bloomsbury in the last few years, and it is fantastic. It's got really useful, really practical advice actually about how to approach LGBTQ plus inclusion in your schools. So it's really, really helpful. Last couple of things. This is this is a display from my classroom. And I talked about this at the Cheltenham Festival, actually. Something I think is really important is asking the students to think about their family history. So at my school, Claremont High School, the students are from very, very diverse backgrounds. So I wanted to celebrate that. So in my classroom, what I did over the summer is they interview someone in their family. I do it over the summer so they've got time to do it. They interview someone over the summer about their family story, about how they got to this country. What they then do is I read it, and then they summarize it on a green card. And then what I allow them to do is I allow them to pin, and you can see the pins there. I allow them to pin the place where their family story started. And it's just a really powerful way of celebrating the diversity in our school. So that is something, maybe you could have one in every classroom in your school, you know, or something like that. So we are at the end. So my top tips are: reflect on what you teach. Remember, decolonizing the curriculum sounds scary, but it's not. Don't be afraid to innovate beyond your historic scheme of work. Change is scary, and change is scary for lots of staff. But I would really recommend starting small. Start with one unit. Maybe start with the unit that you're going to be teaching in the summer. See how that goes, and then, you know, continue from there. But the idea of, you know, abolishing the canon, abolishing everything, and start, you know, and just trying to change everything in one go, is just not realistic. But start with a short-term plan and then see from there. But of course, you know, make it clear that you're creating space for more voices. But also, as we've said with that great question I had, think about talking to the students, talk to parents, etc. It's an ongoing process, what I've just said, really. It's not going to happen overnight. Think medium and long term. You know, you can't be what you can't see. You know, if we go by the key drivers of the disadvantage gap research, role modeled visibility is more important than we might think, actually. So that's a really easy win, I think. Like I said, can you engage students and parents on this journey? And assembly time, things outside the classroom. How can you showcase people that students can relate to, can be inspired by? Put down the PowerPoint of Martin Luther King and Gandhi. Put it down. Find some other stories, because they exist. It is just our job to showcase that to our students. And then finally, again, this is not something that you can do overnight. So think short term. What can you do by December? Maybe, you know, what can you do after half term? Is it maybe that you can do a couple of assemblies? Is it that you can do a display audit around your school and figure out, where the great examples are, share them. Medium term, what can you do by the spring term? Long term, what do you want to do by, May 2021 or September 2021, if we ever get there. And that's it from me. So I apologize, I've talked for a long time. We've only got 10 minutes left. So Aziz, should I stop sharing my screen? Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you so much, Shalina.
Okay, there we go.
Welcome back to the room. I'll just see if anyone does have any final questions or thoughts for you. Katrina posted something just around the assembly that you were talking about and saying, would you mind sharing that assembly? I don't know. If that's...
Yeah. It's an assembly that was from a couple of years ago, but when I get to school tomorrow, I can send it to you, Izzy, or if I can, I can.
Yeah, if you share it with me, then I can send it round to.
I'm actually writing one. I'm writing one for the next Remembrance Day for after half time, which is going to bring in diverse voices. So I can send over some remembrance stuff basically that I've done to help people. That's fine.
Thanks, Shalina. Yeah, and just a comment here from Edward, who just mentioned that his school was quite a military school, and I love the idea of using the kind of alternative iconography that you kind of suggested there. I guess to really flesh it out. So.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually because I saw that actually that he'd commented that he was from a military school, and I think it's really interesting because when I was at Cheltenham, I was talking to, like I said, the two panelists, and they had no idea about. We were talking about food because obviously the founder of Dishoom is obviously a restaurateur, and I was talking about Indian soldiers in the trenches and the fact that I have these photos that I show the students of soldiers making chapatis in the trenches, and they're kind of rolling them, and there's this story that George V, when he visited the trenches, he tried a chapati that had been made by some Indian soldiers. And both the panelists said they had no idea about that. And I think, again, that's because we often, when it comes, and that's the problem with the mainstream coverage of things like VE Day and, and Remembrance Day, is that often the default is to show soldiers who looked a certain way, etc. But it's missing out. Actually, that great story about the fact that there were soldiers making chapatis in the trenches. That is great. Everyone should know that, and I share that with my students when we did that last week when we talked about food in the trenches. So I think it's just something that I think it's just things that are not there, like I said, in the mainstream. And, we know this from, when Lawrence Fox had a mayor when 1917 came out, arguing that, there weren't Indian soldiers in the trenches. There were thousands of them, in fact, so I think it's something that the mainstream is still grappling with, this idea that actually it's just been, and that's the whole point behind decolonization, isn't it? And that shows why it's important, because again, the fact that someone who's a celebrity can go on Twitter and say, why is there an Indian soldier in this film? And they have lots of people that agree with them, when actually it's just not the case. So we have lots of work to do, people. Lots of work to do with our young people so that they can fight all this nonsense that happens.
Thank you so much, Lena. And just to echo a comment here that the session is being incredibly thought-provoking, stimulating and enlightening. And I think what I really value from the sessions is just the amount of resources and really useful practical tips to take from it. And hopefully, colleagues have left with some, feeling inspired by some of the ideas to go back to their schools and their context as well. Conscious of time, and I don't think there is any further questions, so I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you so much, Lena, again for your time and give you a virtual round of applause. I know everyone will join me in doing that as well. Really, really useful. And just to echo, I will be sending around a copy of the slides as well as the resource list as well.
Can I just say, there's a question that I've just seen that I'd like to answer. Is that okay? Someone has says, how can you, actually, was it you that said this? How can you ensure that diversity is embedded rather than a bolt-on? Is that what you said?
I was adding it, but
I think the key thing with this is that, so for example, what I just said about Indian soldiers, rather than when you're teaching World War I, teaching a lesson that has got where you do one separate lesson about Indian soldiers and black soldiers, instead do what I've suggested, where when you talk to the students about food in the trenches, show them a picture of Indian soldiers making chapatis and embed that within the story. When you're talking about recruitment, for example, show them posters that were from different parts of the empire, as well as showing them the posters that were in Britain. So it's blending that story together and showing that these soldiers were all going through the same processes, rather than othering it and having it as a bolt-on, if that makes sense. So yeah, that is how I would suggest you kind of blend the story rather than bolting it on as a separate thing, if that makes sense.
Really useful. Yeah, no, thank you, Shalina, for just picking that up. Yeah, and just lastly to say thank you, everyone, for your time and joining us today. I'm just going to post a link to a feedback form. If you do have the time to fill that out now, that'd be fantastic. I will also be sending it around afterwards as well, so you'll have the opportunity to feedback and let us know your thoughts. We do take feedback very seriously, and it helps to kind of improve our offer going forward, so really appreciate your time.
I've actually just seen that Will has talked about David Olusoga. I'm a David Olusoga fangirl. He's just released this book called Black and British, which is a children's version of his brilliant book called Black and British as well. It's so good. It's every single school should have a copy of this book. It's great for primary, but it's also great for Key Stage 3, just to reflect on what you teach as well. So I'd really recommend getting this book. It was only released last week, I think, or the week before, but it's very, very good, really helpful.
Yeah, and apparently there's a great documentary series on it as well.
Yes, everything he does is just excellent.
Check out David Olusoga. Yeah. Thanks so much. And yeah, just want to say, like I said, thank you so much for your time, Shalina. And yeah,
thank you.
That's all. Yeah, draw close to it.
Thanks, everyone.